Transnational Competition Law course, and dear learner and viewer, we have been discussing the competition laws in China, and we have taken note of in my previous lecture about the laws and policies which are in vogue and practice in China. We have referred to the provisional rules on the development and protection of socialist competition 1980. We have also taken note of the features of the Law of People's Republic of China for countering unfair competition 1993, and lastly we have tries to have a critical appraisal of the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republics of China 2008, and we realize the fact that how the Chinese system or the Chinese competition law, which uses the anti-monopoly nomenclature, happens to share some of the common territories and the common boundaries and the common features of the US as well as the European Union and the BRICS country in advancing the entire corpus of the competition law and policy in China. How the People's Republic of China, through the vehicle of their competition law, have created a kind of a system where they have certain regulatory mechanism, but at the same time they are very conscious of the fact that all kind of the regulatory mechanism relating to merger control or prohibition of anti-competitive agreement or prohibition of abuse of dominance and a kind of a mandatory system of seeking approval and clearance from the government in relation to all kinds of the transactions and agreement happens to be a mandatory condition, but at the same time the Chinese law on anti-monopoly law of People's Republics of China 2008 is not oblivious of the fact that as to what happens to be the social good, common good, people's welfare, and then it tries to create some kind of an exceptions to any kind of the sectors which lies into the improvement of technology, improvement of product quality, improvement of product efficiency, as well as it tries to protect the small and the medium sized industries to flourish and to accelerate and to develop, and it also tries to promote the public interest, the legitimate interest, and then it tries to see that how the very objective of the energy conservation, environmental protection and sustainable development can be achieved within the folds of the competition law in China, especially the people's anti-monopoly law of the People's Republic of China 2008. Dear learner, having understood that, we will try to engage into the lecture today about the enforcement and administration of the anti-monopoly law in China. We will also try to look at the institutional framework of the competition policy, and we will also see that as to how different agencies who are working in the arena of the anti-monopoly law happens to exercise their jurisdictions and promote a very effective competitive regime in China. To this end, we will try to understand that one of the important segment of the Chinese competition law happens to be the institutional framework of the competition policy, and the institutional framework of the competition policy is very important to understand in the sense that it is one of the important characteristics of the Chinese institutional framework of the competition, that it is largely compatible with the Western economies, meaning thereby if you look at the basic precepts and the practice of the competition policy in China and the entire edifice of the institutional framework or entire paraphernalia of the Chinese institutional framework from the standpoint of view of the competition law, what we try to decipher, what we try to underline is the fact that the Chinese competition law is resilient, is very flexible, and it is because of its resilience and the flexibility it has created a wider acceptance among the global competitor and the global market, and promoting competition and the sense of competitiveness across BRICS country, across the world at large. So, the competition policy or the laws for that matter in China is not going to be very regressive, rather it is going to be progressive. It is not going to be very conservative, but it is going to be very flexible. it is not going to be very classical, but it is going to be very modern. And why? The reason happens to be that it has synchronized all the laws and policy in such a manner that it can enhance maximum competition, and the maximum degree of the competition can only be possible if we have a proper assessment of competition policy, which is based on flexibility, which is based on the resilience, which is based on the exuberance of the domestic players and as well as the foreign players, and try to see the entire merger control issue in a very broader framework of not only the markets of the China, but the regional market and the global market. So one of the basic tenets of the competition policy in China happens to be that it has synchronized with the laws of the world and as well as the developed countries and as well as all the countries which happens to forge a kind of a meaningful relation in matters of business, trade, commerce and development. Then we see that the entire issue of the Chinese competition policy happens to be governed by a kind of an enforcement and administration, and here we find, as we have mentioned, that the entire paraphernalia of the enforcement and the administration of the anti-monopoly law in China happens to have many kind of the agencies, many kind of the authorities, and all those authorities have been given a kind of a portfolio, a kind of a subject, a kind of a responsibility, so that they should not have any kind of a multiplicity of the task, but singularity of the task. And in contrast to the multiplicity of the task, there happens to be the singularity of the task, and it is that singularity of the task in the entire administration of the anti-monopoly law in China that the Chinese enforcement and administration happens to be very effective and have very salutary impact in matters of curbing anti-competitive conduct, in matters of curbing the merger control, in matters of abuse of dominance. And then we see that, and we have to see very carefully as to how the Chinese competition law and policy happens to develop a large paraphernalia of the administration and the enforcement to give effect to the competition in China and across China in matters of extraterritorial application or the transnational application of the competition law. To this end, what we find, dear learner and viewer, that under the enforcement and the administration, the anti-monopoly law has created a state council, and the state council is very important, and a state council is further divided into the two regulatory bodies to regulate monopolistic activity. And in this regard, we have to note that there is one state council. The state council is comprising on two more regulatory body. The one regulatory body happens to be the Anti-Monopoly Committee, which is responsible for developing competition legislation and policy, which is responsible in publishing guidelines and which is responsible in coordinating the administrative and as well as the enforcement work of the State Council of the Competition Authority in China. The another authority which has been created under the anti-monopoly law or under the aegis of the State Council is the council known as Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Agency. An anti-monopoly enforcement agency happens to be responsible for enforcing anti-monopoly law, and the enforcement power of the anti-monopoly enforcement agencies are divided between the three agencies. And then that's why we see, that's why we refer that the entire administrative and the enforcement regime in the Chinese competition law or under the anti-monopoly law of 2008 happens to be very elaborate and very comprehensive as to see that there is a state council, then a state council is further divided into two regulatory bodies, The one body happens to be the Anti-Monopoly Committee, which is responsible for developing competition legislation, drafting competition legislation, redesigning competition legislation, and it also engaged into the formulation of the competition policy besides publishing the guidelines, besides coordinating the entire administrative enforcement work. And then it is coupled by and backed by the Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Agency, which is said to be responsible for enforcing the entire anti-monopoly law, the precept of the anti-monopoly law, the features of the anti-monopoly law. This anti-monopoly enforcement agency is having a kind of an executory role, whereas the anti-monopoly committee happens to have a kind of a think tank, a kind of an advisory board, a kind of a recommendatory board, and in contrast to the anti-monopoly committee, which engages in policy formulation, in legal formulations, and other matters of vital importance. The anti-monopoly enforcement agencies, as the name suggests, enforcement happens to be in charge for the execution. And then once you talk of the execution and the enforcement of the anti-monopoly law in China, then the anti-monopoly enforcement agency now again converted into or divided into the three main agencies, and those three agencies are to be understood in right context. And the first agency under the anti-monopoly enforcement agency is the National Development and Reform Commission. It is very important. And what is the role of the National Development and Reform Commission is that they are singularly responsible for price related offenses of under the anti-monopoly law. And the second authority which has been created by the anti-monopoly enforcement agency is a state administration for industry and commerce, and the state administration for industry and commerce is in charge of enforcing monopoly, restrict competition, and other than price related offenses, because the price related matters are taken care of by the National Development and Reform Commission. That's why we see there is no any kind of an overlapping jurisdiction. What state administration for industry and commerce happens to be responsible, that is something different, and what the NDRC is responsible is something different. As we have seen that the National Development and Reform Commission is responsible for price related offenses, whereas the state administration for industry and commerce is responsible for enforcing monopoly agreement, abuse of dominant market position, and abuse of administrative power to eliminate and restrict competition. But their ambit and scope definitely in all matters, be that enforcing monopoly agreement, be that the abuse of dominant power, or be that the abuse of administrative power, but all these powers of the state administration for industry and the commerce happens to be non-price related matters, because the price related matters are taken care of by the National Development and Reform Commission. And the third agency which has been created is the agency known as Ministry of Commerce, which is solely responsible for the merger control. That's why we see that the entire panoply of the enforcement of and the administration of the competition policy consists of Anti-Monopoly Committee and Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Committee, and it is that Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Committee which is executory in nature have created one National Development and Reform Commission, then two the State Administration for Industry and Commerce, and the third And the third, the Ministry of Commerce responsible for merger control. So one is responsible for merger control, one is responsible to implement and execute the basic object of the anti-monopoly law, and one is responsible for price-related offences. Taken together, that we find that the enforcement agencies in Chinese competition law happens to be one of the finest, and in that reference we can say that in order to have an effective implementation of the anti-monopoly law, the State Council, which we have just discussed about, or the Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Agency, happens to see that all these organizations, be that the National Development and Reform Commission, be that the State Administration of Industry and Commerce, or be that the Ministry of Commerce, should act and should work in unison, should work in tandem, should work in synergistic manner and try to give the maximum compliance of the anti-monopoly law through the aegis of anti-monopoly enforcement agencies, whereas the anti-monopoly committee happens to be a kind of a body, think tank body, which tries to engage itself for the designing and redesigning of the laws, designing and redesigning of the policy, and try to coordinate and publish the material and guidelines and protocols and a standard operating procedure for the anti-monopoly law in China. That's why we see that in the entire range of the administration and enforcement in the Chinese competition law and policy, the role of each and every competition authority, be that the National Development and Reform Commission's job, and here we should realize that the anti-monopoly law of the People's Republic of China, which have cast a responsibility on the National Development and Reform Commission, which had been made in charge of price-related offences of the anti-monopoly law, we have to look at that how this organization, National Development and Reform Commission, has been very active and has been, in a sense, have a very good track of record in imposing fines on the companies for the breaches of the competition law, and have always tried to keep a vigilance on the hardcore cartel agreement and the price fixing agreement. And right from the last 10 years, if we peruse some of the achievement of the National Council, National Development and Reform Commission, we see that in 2012, it resulted into the fine, it realized the fine from the 6 LCD manufacturer who happens to have some kinds of the price fixing agreement and having a detrimental effect on the anti-monopoly law. In 2014, what we find that the National Development and Reform Commission came very heavily against the 7 automotive spare parts manufacturer and realized that their 13 product has a tendency to stifle the competition. Thus, we see again in 2013 that there has been some kind of investigation in relating to the baby milk formula manufacturers in 2013, and again we see that there happens to be a large number of cases which has some kind of investigation on consumer related oriented sectors such as automotive, such as electronics, such as eye care, such as milk powder, such as pharmaceuticals, such as premium liquor or insurance sector. In all these sectors, this National Development and Reform Commission have taken a serious note of any kind of a consumer oriented sectors and the violation of anti-monopoly law in China, and thus we see that the entire enforcement of and administration of the anti-monopoly law in China under the anti-monopoly law of People's Republic of China 2008, and the committee which has been constituted like the Anti-Monopoly Committee and Anti-Monopoly Enforcement Committee and its three concerns of National Development and Reform Commission, State Administration for Industry and Commerce, and Ministry of Commerce happens to act in a way that in a very unitary sense and work in tandem to see that the anti-monopoly law of 2008 happens to be a successful case, and each and every agency which has been made in charge of their exclusive jurisdictions and the mandate and term of reference happens to see a great degree of success in the entire scheme of Chinese competition law and policy. With this, dear learner, I conclude, and I just wish that you must have a reading of all these, the functional ambit of all these 5 authorities to understand the actual working and the real world implementation of the competition law in China. With this, I conclude, and I thank and I wish you a happy learning.